Since the year 2010, more than 24 new power generation ventures have been launched in an effort to provide First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people not only with sources of clean power, but also for generating sustainable economic development in those communities. Joining us now from the nation's capital to tell us how this could be an economic game changer for Indigenous Canadians, here's Chris Henderson. He's author of Aboriginal Power, Clean Energy and the Future of Canada's First Peoples. And Chris Henderson, it's great to have you on TVO tonight. How are you doing?
Great to be here, Steve.
Let me start with a bit of an odd line of questioning, but you'll see where I'm going with this. Where are you born, incidentally?
I was born in Bombay, India.
Okay, so you are Indian.
Yeah, I'm Indian.
But not the kind of Indian that we're necessarily talking about in our conversation tonight, right?
No, not. But I think, you can argue who's the real Indian. Though, we're not all that different. We're not all that different, Steve. Last year, I was at the Federation of Saskatchewan Nations meeting, and I was registering. And ahead of me was an Aboriginal person, and one behind me. The guy in front of me was Justin Henderson. The guy behind me was Sean Henderson. So we're just cousins, a bit more distant.
There you go. I gotcha. How is it that you ended up a bit of an expert on Canada's Indigenous peoples and their efforts to come up with this new kind of Aboriginal power, hydropower as opposed to otherwise?
Like a lot of things, Steve, when we have careers, there's a bit of luck and a bit of chance and sometimes some hard work. I was working in the environmental field with companies, and along the way, Aboriginal communities were looking for a chance to develop their opportunities through clean energy. And over the last 20 years, more and more I spent time with that, and now it's my sole occupation. And so I got introduced through Aboriginal communities who needed help. I had some skills in economic and finance and energy, and it seemed to be a good match.
Okay, let's get into this energy policy issues that you've talked about in your book. Namely, let's start here. Canada's a signatory to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I'm wondering how you see that document changing the energy landscape for Canada's First Nations, Métis, Inuit peoples.
That's a great question. We actually have the UN Special Representative for Indigenous People here in Ottawa this week doing a review of this whole relationship between four things. First, we have First Nations territory that leads to rights, that sometimes leads to treaties, but really it's all about resources. And I start in the book in part with the United Nations Declaration because I think it recognizes and affirms that Indigenous people have a right to the land they have occupied for thousands and thousands of years. The real issue is now, how do you recognize those rights in a modern economy? And Aboriginal power is one of the ways you do that. We need power for our economy. We need cleaner energy to fuel our economy. But that can only be done if we can use the resources that were the traditional resources of Aboriginal peoples. So the UN Declaration is connected to the resources we need today.
We know that clean energy is all the rage today, and we know that Crown utilities and energy regulators and governments, both nationally and provincially and territorially, are quite seized of this issue. And I wonder how helpful all of those different institutions are in helping you do what you do and helping ultimately get clean energy to Aboriginal Canadians.
Steve, I think it's really important when people do a good job, we give them a kudo, and I think we really do owe the Ontario government a kudo here. Because with the Green Energy and Economy Act, the government not only said they wanted more clean energy for the province, but they also said, we're going to give some special mechanisms so Aboriginal communities can be full participants and co-owners of that energy in certain projects. So they have special incentives for an additional price for energy where Aboriginal communities own more of the project. They've created an Aboriginal loan guarantee to help Aboriginal communities buy equity into projects. So we've had a coming together of circumstances where we need more power. We want cleaner power. That cleaner power is on the territory of Aboriginal peoples. And the Ontario government policies really recognize that pretty well. I think they deserve a real thank you.
Okay, kudos to the Government of Ontario. How about the Government of Canada?
Mm-hmm. The Government of Canada has had various programs that promote Aboriginal economic development. They tend to be smaller scale. They tend to be important on one clear respect. They provide capital to communities considering to become owners in projects at the early stages. When you're trying to see if the wind or the hydro or the solar resources are there to be commercially viable. And that's a good thing. But the real money comes in when you capitalize the project, and that's where the Ontario mechanisms are stronger and better because they tie to how revenue flows from the project.
Well, can I push back a bit on that? I wonder if you're pulling your punches a bit, because I'm looking at your book now, which is 206 pages long. There's one reference to Prime Minister Harper in the whole book. So I'm wondering whether you maybe want to be a little more critical of the feds in the book than you have been in that last answer.
Well, I'll take that pushback as a fair point. However, I say this. It's not been Prime Minister Harper that's led this. It's been the federal bureaucracy that's largely led this. And in fact, the programs that started to support Aboriginal communities for clean energy started with the previous Liberal government. So Prime Minister Harper hasn't cut that, but he hasn't started anything new either.
Gotcha. Okay. Ontario has, by the reckoning of your book, I think 25 off-grid Aboriginal communities, which means there are, I guess, about 15,000 residents that have to rely on what you might call old technology, dirty, expensive diesel for their heat and their power. This is mostly Northern Ontario, I guess we're talking about. I presume they have options other than those, don't they?
Steve, they don't. These are communities that are hundreds of kilometers from the provincial grid. Sometimes they're, tens of kilometers away from renewable resources. And it's a very difficult economic environment, a very difficult geographic environment. In order to solve that problem, we need to look at transmission connections to the provincial grid, which would also help with economic development, and also tie in where there is a renewable power resource into that. I do know that there is a really, really strong desire in those northern Aboriginal communities to change their future. If you don't have clean power, if you don't have reliable power, you just can't have a social or economic system that works. It's really debilitating. But we need some attention brought to this. There have been noises about it for many years. I think the time is right, though, now to really make some progress with some nice transmission lines that connect them to the grid and really tap into the renewable resources that are there. But it's going to take some effort and some support from government. It's not going to happen just by standing still.
What about solar and wind? Are they options?
Oh, absolutely. Particularly solar. Solar is a really strong resource that people underestimate. And even apart from the darkest months of the winter, they're pretty good. It's a pretty good resource. And wind in some locations. What you have to make sure with wind energy is that the wind is consistent and it's there when you really need it. That's not intermittent. But I would say that all those power sources are part of the game. You have to make the assessment which ones are the best for the community you're working in.
Okay, in Northern Ontario, near Kapuskasing, there is something called the Big Beaver Falls Hydroelectric Project. And you've quoted Chief Anita Stevens in the book as having said this about that. This is a true reflection of our traditional teachings of looking after the next 7 generations. Can you explain how this project brings about that result that she just described?
Steve, with clean energy, wind, hydro, solar, geothermal, what I think you have is a fit between the cultural traditions of First Nations and Métis communities in terms of using the earth wisely and the green power that we want. And so I think what Chief Anita Stevens is referring to is 2 things. Firstly, that the renewable resource is consistent with the cultural traditions of First Nations and the gifts the Creator has given them and all of us. And secondly, it's also a way in which they have legacy into the future in an economic context. It truly is the kind of sustainable development, fits you're trying to find. And I think that's what she's referring to.
Okay, but what we're talking about tonight is mostly pretty cutting-edge, high-tech stuff. And I note that the 2006 census showed that 1/3 of Indigenous Canadians off reserve and 50% of those living on reserve didn't finish high school. So one has to ask how capable Aboriginal communities are in taking advantage of these clean energy opportunities. One might think they don't have the education, or at least not enough of them have the education to make this happen.
On one hand, I agree with you. The situation of education and graduation rates of First Nations and Métis communities is really dire and has to change. But that hasn't stopped those communities from being full partners in clean energy projects. Let me give you one story. Pick River is an Aboriginal community east of Thunder Bay. They did their first clean energy project almost 20 years ago. Since that time, they've done 5. And these are not small projects, they're large. In total, those projects represent around $300 million of financing for wind and hydro. And if you go to Pick River, that was led by the people of Pick River, by the chief and by the economic development officer, Byron Leclerc. They developed those projects with partners. And so yes, maybe more people could be graduating high school and then on to university and college, but the leaders that are there are dedicated to this. They're really gripped with the fact of how clean energy is a fit with their traditions and really is a way out of poverty, because if you create wealth You know, and I was talking to Sean Atleo, the National Chief, a few days ago, and Sean said to me, Chris, it's not if you have wealth, it's how you make it and what you use with it. If you create wealth with clean energy and that helps you fund an education system or helps you fund the education of college and university for these young people, you change the game. Clean energy, Aboriginal power is a game changer for Aboriginal communities.
And if I read you right, it just takes one great leader to make it happen.
It does. You know, Chief Denise Rastoul, another story of the Doki's First Nation south of Sudbury, where Lake Nipissing flows into the French River, the connector between the Ottawa River watershed and the Great Lakes. This was the route for Etienne Brûlé and Saint-Louis de Champlain to find the fur trade. And Chief Rastoul, for the last 7 years, has led that community, and she has driven through the vision of her community to make a powerhouse beside dams that already exist, viable projects for their community. And that project started construction 3 months ago. It's going to be finished in about a year and a half. That will last for 40 years. It will be an economic generator, an income generator for the Doki's First Nation, and that's because of her and her people.
Okay, we've been talking Northern Ontario, but let's talk British Columbia as well, because you've got a quote from Paul Correa, the head of Clean Energy BC, as saying, clean energy is to First Nations in the 21st century what hunting and fishing were in the 1900s. And I wonder, what would more Indigenous students going into, say, engineering or going into resource management programs do for the future of this issue in a broad way?
Well, I'll tell you where I was earlier today, Steve. I was in Montreal. I was at the meeting of the Canadian Electricity Association, looking at the whole issue of jobs and their need for new employees who can be in the line trades, who can work on clean energy projects, hydro projects, and transmission lines. They need 50,000 people in the next 5 years. If we can find that pipeline from Aboriginal communities, I think it's a great win-win for Canada and for our electricity structure and Aboriginal communities. So there is an unmet need to fill those resources. The challenge now is to create a pipeline of people, Aboriginal young people, who can get those qualifications. You're not going to get those qualifications if you don't have the capital to get the education you need. Clean energy projects such as the ones that Paul Correa refers to gives them the capital, but are there the jobs for them if they get that education? Absolutely.
Well, again, I'm going to push back on this, because, and I'm trying not to sound like a killjoy here, but
not a problem.
Umbata Falls project near Marathon, Ontario. 50 jobs for the Aboriginal community during construction, 2 full-time operating jobs. That just doesn't sound impactful enough, is it?
Well, Umbata Falls is run by the Pick River First Nation, and if you go to the Pick River First Nation community, you will find the health center there, almost 100% employment. The women's center's there, the hockey rink's there. The community is stable because of the income from those projects. So you get 2 kinds of impacts from these projects, and then you spin from there. So first of all, there's the jobs. Yes, high jobs in construction, many fewer jobs during operations, but the Pick River First Nation owns Umbata Falls. They make millions of dollars a year from selling power of that project they own, and they channel that money back into the economy of the community to provide social and health services and for economic development. So the money for the project becomes an economic generator that helps them create new businesses, and that's just a cycle. In the book I talk about a clean energy capital circle. The clean energy projects are the driver that allow you to create income and wealth that creates more economic development. So the impact of Umbata Falls is way, way more than 2 jobs. It's in fact not just 2 jobs, but dozens of jobs, but also income that changes the community.
Okay, fair point, and I'm glad you clarified that. I want to follow up with a bit of a touchy-feely question here, and that is, in the book you've quoted W.O. Mitchell, his novel, Who Has Seen the Wind. You've talked about Ian and Sylvia Tyson, who of course got the classic song, 4 Strong Winds. And I wanted to ask whether there is something about the wind or the power that one derives from the wind that is particularly resonant with Canada's Indigenous peoples. What do you think?
You know, it seems so, Steve. I get more questions about wind power from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities than any other. They say, Chris, the wind blows here. Can we convert that into energy? And sometimes you can, many times you can't. The resource may not be strong enough. But it seems to be that the wind's speaking to them. If you look at it a bit in a softy, feely way, but really in an earth way, is that it connects with them. They see the wind blowing, they feel the wind blowing, and they want to see if they can generate power with that. And some of the developments of wind energy technologies has allowed some communities to do that. It is a big challenge. It's not an easy thing to do. You got to make sure the resource is there. But I'm also pleased you refer to those songs. One of the things that I've tried to do in Aboriginal Power is really stress we've got a great geography and a great cultural traditions, And people who read the book will find a lot about that, a lot of Canada in there, a lot of Ontario in there, and a lot about the creative spirit of our country.
Well, I got to tell you, Chris, I spend some of the summers up on Manitoulin Island, and I can't help but notice, as I was driving through what they used to call West Bay, which is now Chiging
Yes.
First Nation, there are windmills, I won't say all over the place, but there are windmills there. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the Mother Earth Renewable Energy Wind Project that is run by the Chiging First Nation on Manitoulin Island.
Yeah, well, since you vacation up there, Steve, you do know that the wind does blow very hard on Manitoulin Island.
Yes, it does.
And there are really strong bluffs. And if the oaks are bent, you know the wind's good, and the oaks are bent on Manitoulin. And Chief Joe Hare of the Michiching First Nation, he said, look, let's develop this about 10 years ago. And I've been talking to him ever since that time. Then he brought on board a really qualified wind energy technical developer by the name of Graham Findlay. They measured the site. They put up what they call wind energy anemometers that measure the quality of wind. And it was really solid. And over the course of 4 or 5 years, they developed the project. They own 100% of the project. When they commissioned the project, they brought out David Suzuki to launch it. The wind turbines are turning. And that's the start of the first major economic development enterprise owned by that First Nation community. It builds pride. It builds pride in their land. It builds pride in their people. It builds pride in place. And it builds pride in their ability to convert that to an economic future. And so I think the multiplier effects of Aboriginal power are not just that project. It's much more holistic and much deeper and more enduring than just that.
Yes, but we know particularly down in southern Ontario there have been significant protests against wind power. A lot of it has to do with inadequate local consultation and so on. But I wonder whether in your experience you find people are more forgiving of these wind farms if it's an Aboriginal community that's actually running them.
I'm not entirely sure that's the case. I think you have to make sure that wind farms are located far away from residential developments, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. What I would say is that if you have an Aboriginal wind power project, it likely is on an Aboriginal reserve or an Aboriginal territory that is not near private ownership. So as a result, it's away from others. As a result, there's probably more support for Aboriginal power projects like that are wind projects, because they're not near residences or farms of others. And I think that's the main concern of people. Is it affecting me on a health basis, or is it affecting my enjoyment of nature? And most Aboriginal wind power projects have not been of that kind. So there's probably more support for that than some projects which are sort of near people's farms and homes.
Gotcha. A few minutes left. I want to touch on two more things. The first is, do we have in this country a national Aboriginal clean energy jobs strategy?
No.
Do we need one?
But we should.
We should have one, you think?
Yeah, we should. The reality is that, as I've described in Aboriginal Power, these are not just a few projects doing this. There are 80 projects operating or almost completed today. There's another 60 to 80 that are coming online. They range from $50 million to $3 billion in size. They have a lot of needs in construction and a lot of needs after. So there's a great opportunity for that. And as I mentioned earlier, the Canadian electricity companies, companies like Ontario Power Generation and Hydro One, they need to fill jobs. People are retiring. And so I do think that Aboriginal workforce is primed to fill those jobs, and they're primed to take ownership and management of the resources that they are developing now. Boy, that sounds like a really good news story, that we can really get Aboriginal people employed, promote their education, and they can deliver the clean energy we want.
Okay, and in our last minute here, I mentioned this earlier in the program, but I think it bears repeating as well. We are 250 years plus 1 day removed from the announcement of the Royal Proclamation, the so-called Indian Magna Carta, back in 1763, where essentially the Crown came to an agreement with the Indigenous people at the time and said, here's how we are going to share the resources of this great land. And as we know, it hasn't exactly worked out that way over the last 250 years. Sean Atleo, the AFN Grand Chief, saying the treaty relationships and aspirations that were expressed in the Royal Proclamation are about us sharing the land, wealth, and resources of this country. That has not happened, he said. I wonder, your book's called Aboriginal Power, a double entendre, obviously. Can Aboriginal power be a game changer in making the promise of that proclamation come true?
Steve, I'm biased, But not only do I agree that it can be a game changer, it already is a game changer. And it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because the many stories that are changing the Aboriginal future for our country that represents a more holistic, affirming, and positive story of our country's relationship with our First Peoples. This is what Aboriginal Power is about. It is changing our country, it's changing Aboriginal people, and perhaps to your key point, start and finish, it's changing the way Canada relates to its First Peoples. It's running a Canadian story, not the story we've written for the last 250 years.
Aboriginalpower.ca is the website. Aboriginal Power is the name of the book. Chris, we're so thankful you could spare some time for us tonight from the nation's capital. Thanks very much.
My pleasure, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.